Good afternoon. Welcome to Capital Account. I'm Lyster here in Washington, D.C. These are headlines for Friday, November 23rd, 2012. EU budget talks have collapsed. The Wall Street Journal's Matina Stevis reports wealthier countries say there just isn't enough restraint in the plan. So is this a sign of disintegration in the beleaguered Eurozone? Or is this political theater 101 of the type we see so often in the U.S. surrounding a budget or, say, raising the debt ceiling? Well, Ms. Stevis is here to tell us. Plus, Mario Draghi rattled off the ECB's recent actions, concluding this.
Therefore, I can address you today against the background of a relative return confidence in the prospects of the euro area.
But is that really the case, that we've seen a return to confidence, or is the euro crisis fatigue and other headline-grabbing news such as the U.S. fiscal cliff just making it seem like the worst in Europe is behind us? We'll try to answer that. And it is Black Friday. Cue craziness at some of the nation's big box retailers, inside and out. Some crazy images, and the last one were actually protesters outside Walmart protesting what they allege are unfair working conditions. We'll have some of your reactions to the protests and viewer feedback. Let's get to today's Capital Account. If the Eurozone crisis seems to be getting upstaged by seemingly newer crises like, say, the U.S. fiscal cliff, or as we like to call it, econoria, let's back up and take stock. The Eurozone is back in recession. Another nation, Cyprus, is on the verge of a bailout. Wrangling over how to get Greece on track with creditors is still not resolved, and talks just collapsed among European leaders trying to agree on a budget for the next 7 years. So in other words, the EU isn't anywhere near out of the woods. And it's also important to remember, looking from abroad at the headlines coming out of these most recent budget talks too, that these are politicians needing to score political points. So you may not be able to take everything that you read at face value. So to separate fact from fiction, we spoke to Matina Stevis, journalist for the Dow Jones Newswires and the Wall Street Journal, who has been covering this all in Brussels. Take a listen. Joining us now, Matina Stevis, journalist for the Dow Jones Newswires and the Wall Street Journal. She's been covering all of this. Matina, EU budget talks collapsed. Leaders failed to reach an agreement on the budget with, according to your reporting, wealthier countries saying there just wasn't enough restraint in the proposed 7-year spending plan. You're there. You've gotten a good feel for the EU politics and the sticking points too. How real are the divisions? Because, of course, we hear about them, but I want to know how real they are, or if this is just political theater. And I'm saying that in the context, of course, here in the U.S., where we've seen debt ceiling wrangling and budget wrangling becoming the status quo of kind of political theater.
There is absolutely political theater involved in these negotiations. I believe Tony Blair famously said that they were actually tougher negotiations than the ones he had to hold to negotiate the Northern Ireland peace process. So it really is the place, those budget talks. And remember, they're for 7 years, right? It's a very long time. It really is a place where national problems, political problems that leaders are facing at home, play out on a European level. Each of them comes wanting something. Some of the wealthier member states, like you mentioned, want cuts to the budget. But some of the wealthier member states also disagree among themselves about how big those cuts would be. Some of the poorer states, and I can tell you for sure that most states are now poor and really needing the money from the EU budget, want to keep those levels of spending as high as possible for the next 7 years because they stand to benefit benefit. A real sticking point always has been, for example, money spent on the so-called common agricultural policy, which economists and several people around the world have decried as essentially subsidies for European agricultural products. Now, France sees the common agricultural policy and spending on that as a holy cow. But then, on top of all of that, you have Britain and the British Prime Minister, who has advocated for cutting way above and beyond what anyone else has. So how do you reconcile all this? How do you bring these people around the table and get an outcome? Obviously, they couldn't do it tonight, and it looks like they're going to be reconvening early next year to talk about that. But one important thing to note is they're under not a lot of time pressure, so they can let this process drag out for a little longer.
Okay, so I think that's important to note, the political theater that you're talking about, because it's easy with so much attention paid to the Eurozone to go, oh no, talks broke down, this is crazy. But I guess I'm curious, in terms of the sense you get, is there a sense in Brussels with EU leaders that, okay, really we all just need to find the right terms for continued integration, this is all going to work out, or is there a real sense that they're kind of fighting against disintegration?
I think there's a real sense here that eventually, it may be after 3 summits, it's happened in the past, a solution will be found. But there will be concessions. There's no doubting that. There is no doubting that we will not be seeing the kind of expenditure we saw in the previous 7-year period that is now coming to an end. And it really means that the EU budget will reflect the state of the economies of the European Union, which, as you know very well, isn't great. The danger there is the cutting in those so-called cohesion funds, the funding that goes to supporting the poorer regions within the EU, which has helped what we call in Europe a very popular term, what we call convergence. So pooling up those poorer regions and poorer countries to look a lot more like their richer counterparts. And there will be cuts in that. But the political theater is extremely important. For example, David Cameron, the British Prime Minister that I mentioned earlier, needs, for his own party's sake, to keep his party together, needs to appear to be very, very tough with the Europeans. And he said coming in today, he told us upon his arrival, what we're doing at home, that's what has to happen in Europe. We have to cut unnecessary spending.
Right, and that's kind of the point that struck me reading the British press reporting on David Cameron's comments, where he's saying, hey, Brussels is living in a parallel universe, and he blamed the European Commission essentially for the breakdown, saying that they're insulting taxpayers by refusing to accept cuts in its budget or make reductions in staff pay or in perks, complaining that 200 staff earn more than he did. So I'm curious if those complaints have merit, or if this is just kind of part of the political grandstanding.
I think a bit of both. I think, first of all, it's important to remind viewers who look at this and think, oh my God, this is this massive thing at stake. The actual core of the debate is about 1% of 1% of the total EU economic output. So we're talking about 1% of 1%. It's not a lot of money. That doesn't mean that it should be badly spent. And Mr. Cameron has a point that there is waste, and we've seen every administration that there is waste and there is space to cut. What he doesn't, however, mention that often is that the spending at the European Commission, which is the EU's bureaucracy essentially, is under 7% of the total EU budget. So it really represents a very, very small slice of the whole of the budget of the EU that is currently under negotiation. And as for the 200 people that earn more than him, perhaps he's right, and perhaps, actually I believe that is a fact that he mentions, and that may be something to address, capping those salaries. But really, it is important just to be sure that we know what the context of this is. It's a very small amount of money in the grand scheme of things. A popular argument to make, though. Traveled here to Washington to our conversation, to be sure. And then, of course, the ECB president, Mario Draghi, for his part, we heard him talking about a return to confidence in the euro area. I don't know. Are you confident, Matina? Are markets confident? Because it doesn't really seem like there has been much improvement, except maybe that people are getting distracted by some other more recent headline-grabbing problems like the U.S. fiscal cliff. Well, I think, first of all, when we talk about markets, and actually when we talk about our own viewers and you know, my paper's readers, there is an element of fatigue, right? The Eurozone crisis has been going on for 3 long, tumultuous, exhausting years. And it's only the potency of the crisis begins to evaporate as it becomes from acute, it goes to becoming chronic and systemic and really deeply inset in the foundations of the economy. I personally think that that's a bigger danger. Now, is market confidence restored? I think one thing that has certainly happened, and actually Mr. Draghi himself has been instrumental in bringing that change, has been a reduction in fears of a Eurozone breakup instigated by a dramatic exit of Greece from the common currency area here in Europe. I think Mr. Draghi's announcements over the summer and what happened over the summer, the calm, and we've seen that continue until now, even though the actual problems have not been resolved. The problems with Greece haven't been resolved. Ireland may be doing better under its own bailout, but there's still a lot of work to be done there, and it's a vulnerable economy in its own way. Portugal, a smaller economy also, but still struggling with internal problems. And then we get to Spain, already receiving a bailout for its banks. And the big question, will they also ask for a bailout for the country, for the public spending? And then there's Cyprus, which got truly annihilated by the Greek crisis because of the close linkages between the two countries. And then there's the issue of almost, you know, you get to France, and it's been downgraded, as we heard this week, by a credit rating agency. And so we may not be as spooked by the Eurozone crisis. That may have to do with the fact that we're just really tired of it. But I don't think that the worst is over, in a sense that the acuteness of the crisis may be wearing off. But the fact that the Eurozone is not growing, it's stagnating, it's very, and even in Germany, you know, growth rates are very low. That's something to worry about in the longer term.
And more on how that's being felt on the ground in the core. We hear about Greece and how Greek people are suffering, but are Germans, are folks in Brussels, are they feeling the Eurozone's recession? We'll hear from Matina Stevis on that after the break. Also, still ahead, a tale of 2 corporations, Walmart, where workers are protesting for higher pay, versus Costco, where they pay their workers a little better. We heard from you, a lot of colorful responses, insightful ones too. You'll hear some in tonight's viewer feedback, but first, your closing market numbers. Welcome back. What's really interesting to note, to not let get by you, is that as leaders in Europe talk about dealing with these problems, talk about cutting Greece's debt load, and they mull the options to get the bailout program back on track, there are disagreements that persist on very basic things that you'd imagine creditors would be on the same page about. Case in point, this November 13th disagreement between Jean-Claude Juncker, head of the Eurozone Finance Ministers Group, and the IMF's Christine Lagarde on the appropriate timeline for Greece.
120% by 2020. We clearly have different views.
The target of 120 will remain, but the target as far as the time frame is concerned has been postponed to 2022. That was not a joke.
He said it under his breath, but he gave a different year for Greece to reach its debt plans than Christine Lagarde. And no, it's certainly not a joke. None of this is, as Matina Stevis, journalist for the Dow Jones Newswires and the Wall Street Journal, laid out for us when we talked about the latest economic figures. Of course, and looking at the data that's coming out at the economic data, looking at the Eurozone in its entirety, it is officially back in recession. And we hear about the core slowing down. We got the preliminary version of the PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index from market for November, showing a decline in economic activity, kind of a continuation of numbers that we see. But again, they are numbers. These are charts on paper that paint a picture of an economy that is not improving, but is going actually the other way. But what I want to know, I'm sure you travel, Matina, a lot for your work. We know that people in Greece feel the contraction. They feel the pain because we hear about it all the time. But I'm wondering if in France or in Germany or in Brussels, if people are feeling this slowdown, if they're feeling the recession.
I think the view from the ground is very much actually connected to the view that we see painted by those economic indicators that you mentioned. So really, what we've seen in the Eurozone has been an uneven recovery following the kind of 2007-2008 crisis. And the unevenness of it is very well reflected in unemployment rates and growth rates. So in the context of the Eurozone, we often talk about the core Eurozone with the Germanys and the Finlands and the Austrias and the so-called periphery. Now, while the definition of those two core periphery terms is really not that clear, so, you know, France obviously would be core, but its economy, as the Economist Weekly magazine pointed out a couple of weeks ago, gives us reason to worry about it. That kind of attitude that we see in the economic indicators is reflected on the ground. So you won't see the same feeling on the street and the same confidence, because so much above the economy is about confidence. And the streets of Lisbon, the streets of Athens, and the streets of Berlin or Paris, it's really not the same thing. And you know, there's just far too many shades of gray in the Eurozone right now. So while Germans may be more optimistic, and it's not like they're crazy optimistic, but they have reason to be more optimistic than Greeks, it is certainly the case that in Greece and in Lisbon and in Portugal and in Ireland, the mood is not at all that. And in places like, you know, Belgium has actually come out looking a lot better over the last few months. But even here, people worry because the one thing the crisis has done is show, even to the ordinary man on the street, how interconnected the Eurozone economies are. So basically, like someone would say, you know, when your neighbor's house is burning, you have to worry about your own house too.
And so much of that hangs in the balance with discussion of the banking union, which is very much still a discussion. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of one of the economies you're talking about, when you talk about uneven recovery, uneven lending, of course, Greece has just been front page when it comes to the Eurozone crisis, regardless of how tired people are of it. But you know how the news business is. I know how it is. People want drama when it comes to the headlines, and that is what Greece has supplied. I'm curious, how much do you think it's distracting from countries like Spain and Italy, perhaps benefiting them and buying them time politically to get it together?
I think it really varies. It's a very interesting question that you pose. I think it varies. Sometimes the constant infighting over Greece, how to deal with Greece's debt, the drama in the Greek parliament, the drama on the Greek streets, have actually provided a distraction, exactly like you say. And because no one right now is as bad as Greece, and obviously the market works in kind of comparative terms as well, other countries have benefited politically and potentially economically by the situation in Athens and the rest of Greece. However, I think it's a double-edged knife, and you really can't count on Greece distracting anyone for much longer. For example, I think both the Spanish Prime Minister and the Italian Prime Minister, Mariano Rajoy and Mario Monti, respectively, have pointed out that the insecurity around Greece and the lack of a resolution, a final resolution about what will happen with this country, is it in the Eurozone or is it out, have actually raised insecurity about their own countries and have reflected badly, especially in terms of their borrowing costs. So the longer the Greek drama goes on for, the worse these countries are faring overall, on average, because of this continued uncertainty. Mind you, also, the policymaking process around Greece and Greece's problems has been so fraught and so slow and so incremental and so grueling that a rational participant in the market will look back at this and think, well, if they can't deal with such a small country that is now 2% GDP of the Eurozone and shrinking, what will they do when it comes to bigger countries? What will they do when it comes to dealing with the third and fourth largest economies in the region, which are Spain and Italy and Spain? So I think that it may be politically expedient just for a very brief period of time to be fixating on Greece because Greece is dramatic. But by and large, I don't think it does anyone any favors.
Yeah, and speaking of the muddling through, speaking of the grueling nature of all of this, especially with Greece, what is the deal with the deal to cut the debt? Who are the major parties that need to be consulted, negotiated with in order to make changes to Greece's cumulative interest payments on the national debt?
Well, I mean, listen, this is a massively multilateral negotiation. It is extremely tough. I covered the Greek debt restructuring earlier this year, and I thought that was a tough negotiation because it involved private sector creditors, banks, as well as hedge funds. It involved all the countries in the Eurozone, involved the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank. And honestly, I think that even removing the private sector from the picture, those guys can make it pretty tough for themselves just by themselves. Right now, what we're looking at is this. We had a meeting here in Brussels last Tuesday. It feels like years ago, but also feels like yesterday because this week has just merged into one big thing. That meeting was Eurozone finance minister, the IMF's chief, Christine Lagarde was here, Mario Draghi from the ECB was here. Everyone sat around the table and tried to decide what they're going to do to restore Greece's debt to a sustainable level over the medium term. Having arrived at that point was a very big success because they couldn't even agree, and I don't think they have quite yet agreed on what they define as sustainable. And over what sort of time horizon we're talking about here. But anyway, they get into their room. They sat there for 12 hours, and at around 5 a.m., they just rushed out of the building telling us, and there were a few of us, brave few souls left at that time, telling us that they hadn't reached an agreement and they would have to reconvene this coming Monday. Now, we heard today that there will also be a teleconference on Saturday, tomorrow, to prepare this meeting, and this teleconference will be with the participation of Eurozone finance minister and representatives of the IMF. And really, there is one big fault line between the IMF, which has very strict rules about debt sustainability. It's part of its mandate, it's part of its charter, and it cannot be involved in bailouts and in countries that do not have a kind of guaranteed medium-term debt sustainability, and the rest of the Eurozone. But also, each member state in the Eurozone has different opinions and has different interests on what should happen in terms of Greece's bailout. None of them wants to lose money. They can't go back to their parliaments and explain that they've lent this country so much money and eventually they're not going to see it back or not going to see part of it back. So it's a really impossibly complicated negotiation that's been dragging on for a very long time. However, what we have been hearing, which is positive, is that there's now a few billion left between the negotiating parties that they need to figure out. And people here today have been upbeat. I saw Jean-Claude Juncker, the president of the Eurozone Finance Ministers Group and also Prime Minister of Luxembourg. And I bumped into him in the building we were having the summit at, and he said he was very confident that there would be a solution for Greece on Monday. Greece, on the other hand, for the first time says, you know, it's not our fault. This is our creditors that have to figure it out. For the first time in the 2.5 years that Greece has been in a bailout program, it's not Greece that's causing the trouble.
You heard her, just a few $1 billion left. We'll see if they can't resolve that on their conference call tomorrow. That was Matina Stevis with Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal. Before we go this Friday, let's wrap up with viewer feedback because we got overwhelmingly interesting feedback on a topic we discussed on Wednesday. We contrasted Walmart purportedly paying workers very little, scrimping on benefits, and as you know, they protested today, We compared that to Costco, which is another big box retailer which is known to treat employees pretty well. And here is what you had to say on Facebook. Joshua Fabian said, "My first job was at Walmart, and I hated that job. The pay was bad, the managers were rude, and the customers just hated you. I now work at Costco, and I love my job. The pay is awesome, the managers treat me awesome, and for the most part, our members are awesome to work for. God bless Costco." So if this guy's true, if that's really true what he says, then I guess that kind of supports what we were saying on Wednesday. And there's the incalculable about treating your employees a little bit better. We can't confirm that his story is true, but we thought it was worth reading. In addition, we talked about CEOs delivering for shareholders as a reason for always cutting costs or not giving employees more money. And here's what Steve Berg had to say. "My experience as an employee and shareholder is that maximizing shareholder value is a myth and a farce. Instead, corporations work hard to maximize executive compensation." We've certainly seen some examples of that where companies fail but still manage to pay their executives quite nicely, even during bankruptcy. We've seen that with Hostess. We saw that with MF Global. Anyway, good point. Moving on, Kimberly Badgett said that Walmart is the master at shifting the cost of its products elsewhere, to the environment, to the taxpayer who has had to subsidize underpaid employees with Medicaid and food stamps, to the slave labor in China. Walmart has a high social cost, but the American public is good at ignoring the true cost of Walmart's products. Nothing hits that home quite like video that we saw today, like this. No, they sure were not deterred. We will leave you with those images because that is all we have time for. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to come back next week. And in the meantime, you can follow me on Twitter at Lauren Lyster. You can like our Facebook page, catch our shows on YouTube or on Hulu. Come back on Tuesday. We'll have a debate between Mike Shedlock and Peter Schiff. But for now, have a great night.